Hey everybody, welcome back to Be Like Christ. We're talking about Matthew chapter 7 today in our Bible study series. Again, if you have not already, go out to the website tobelikechrist.com, grab a set of the notes that we're going to be reading off of. You can find those under the resources tab on the front page. Also, if you want a book that explains some of the fundamentals of the Bible, go out and grab this book. It's a free ebook online on the website. Also, you can get a hard copy like this one on Amazon, and it explains, let's see, what does this book explain? Why are there books inside of the Bible? What are the Old and New Testament? Who wrote it? When was it written? How long is it? Gives you some summaries of each book of the Bible, summary of the Old and New Testament. So a lot of good stuff in here, a lot of resources that will help a new Bible student especially, or somebody who's helping somebody to understand the Bible. All that out of the way. Now, Matthew chapter 7. Now, Matthew chapter 7, important to remember, if you're just jumping in for the first time in this video, it's like jumping into the end of a 3-point sermon. Because this sermon now, this is the Sermon on the Mount. It's been going on for 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7. So it's like jumping in on the third point of a 3-point sermon. Jesus taught in 3-point sermons. No, that's bad Bible application. Why? Because chapters were not in the Bible until about 1000 AD. Verses weren't in the Bible until about 1500 AD. So don't ever let somebody try to use the Sermon on the Mount as a 3-point sermon justification. Wrong. Bad Bible interpretation. So, but I digress. We're coming in at the tail end of a sermon. And so if you just pick it up here, you're probably going to lose a lot. And so ideally, go back to the beginning of Matthew chapter 1. But if you can't do that, go back to Matthew chapter 5 and read the whole sermon and we can study it out. But okay, Matthew chapter 7. I don't have as many notes today. I don't know if I was just like lazy when I was writing these notes. I wrote them a while ago, but hopefully this will be a little bit more of a concise lesson. I don't think there's anything particularly hard in Matthew chapter 7, real practical stuff here. And so hopefully we'll be able to understand it. And again, if you want more details, you can always hit me up in the question or the descriptions down below. And I'll try to explain anything that I don't really flesh out here in the notes. So Matthew chapter 7, let's read verses 1 through 5. And you're going to notice that verse 1 is a really popular verse that you hear quoted all the time. Judge not, that you be not judged. For with what judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So a significant portion of the Sermon on the Mount has really been dedicated to rooting out a hypocritical heart. Someone who's pretending that they're religious, but they're really not. Or somebody, it's about getting down deeper into the intent behind the laws that God is giving, because God is more interested in our hearts than simply our external actions. And he doesn't want somebody to be one person on the outside and be another person on the inside. That's hypocritical. So here, again, he's talking about judgment. That's what we're focused on here at the beginning, judging other people. Don't be a hypocrite when you judge other people. So the hypocrites in Jesus' day, much like today, are often very quick to judge other people. And while they are guilty of the very things that they are judging in the hearts of others. In some cases, the religious leaders of the Jews were making up rules and laws in addition to God's laws, and then they were trying to bind those on people. They were telling people that they needed to follow those when in fact they didn't. And so they had become judges of these traditions, of these things that they never should have been judging people about. And Jesus actually says that they make the burdens of other men really great, really heavy, because they're just making things up and then judging people. And you got to think about the time period that this is in too. Most of the common people didn't have an education like common people today. And so they were in many ways probably dependent on the Jewish elite to tell them how to live the life as a good Jew. Many of them probably couldn't read the old law, so they'd go to the synagogue and they'd hear these things read, and then they'd hear them interpreted by the scribes or the Pharisees or the Sadducees, and they would be dependent on what they told them. So if the Pharisees told them, oh, well, you need to be doing this, and it wasn't actually in the old law, a lot of people probably never would have known. So they thought that they had to do that as part of their responsibility to God. And the Pharisees were looking down their nose at those people and becoming judges where they shouldn't have been judges. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Jesus sternly warns these types of people that if they judge others harshly and unjustly, they will receive a harsh judgment back from God. The unmerciful in judgment would receive no mercy. You remember the Beatitude when we started off this sermon. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are those who are merciful. They know that their sins have been forgiven. They know that how patient God has been with them, so they are patient with other people. Here, he kind of flips that on its head, says, if you don't show any mercy to anybody else, God's not going to show you any mercy. In verse 2, where it says, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Kind of brings the golden rule to mind, at least for me, that we'll read about in a little bit. Imagine if we only judged other people on the standards that we would like to be judged. One of the inconsistencies in human nature is that we are often really, really quick to point out somebody else's fault. It just comes so naturally, just in the human, I don't know. It's just almost built into the way we are. We're so quick to point out the flaws of others, and a lot of that has to do with we want to look good, and so we drag others down and are quick to point out their flaws. But imagine, well, let me ask you this. When you make a mistake, when you fall down, when you trip up, when you are not what you should be, how do you want other people to treat you? How do you want them to judge you? You want them to be kind and gentle and easy in their judgment. And often you want to explain to them all of the variables that you've been struggling with that have led you to this situation. Because a lot of times people don't see those. They don't see how hard it's been for you. And so when you slip up, there's all this backstory to it that only you know, but other people look at you and they judge you harshly because they're just coming at it from without having all the details. They didn't know how you struggled. They didn't know how you fought for a long time to do the right thing, and then whoops, you made a mistake. We want people to be kind in their judgment. And so he says, well, the judgment that you extend to other people is the judgment that you are going to receive. And so when we think about that for application in our own lives, the Pharisees obviously weren't doing a very good job at it, but for us, the next time you see somebody trip up, really make a mistake, first of all, be slow to pass judgment. And if they really genuinely are in the wrong, put yourself into their situation and say, what factors have they had that has made this difficult for them? And the godly way to approach and to correct another person is to first to look at yourself, to see if you have that problem. And if you have that problem, you ought not to be judging somebody else who's fallen in that way. Instead, you ought to be correcting it in yourself. He talks about here somebody who has a speck in their eye. You see your brother, he has this little tiny thing in his eye, and you have this giant log, like giant piece of wood in your eye, and you're like, oh, let me help. I'm going to help you get this speck out of your eye. That doesn't make any sense because you've got something in your eye yourself. He says, get the thing out of your eye first, and then you'll be capable of helping your brother to get that little thing out of his eye. So we would correct that problem in our own lives. That's the proper way to approach it. And then rather than just passing judgment for the sake of passing judgment on somebody else, you will know better how to help them escape the sin that ensnares them because you've already dealt with it in your life and hopefully in your heart and rooted it out. And someone who sees someone else struggling like they once struggled is often especially equipped to help them because they know the variables that pull on the heart that lead them down that road of temptation or struggle, and they'll be able to better address and to help them. God doesn't pass judgment on us and then not offer us help. You think about that. How many times do I pass judgment on another person, but in no way do I even consider how I might help them? How many times have I looked at even people, in the pew at church and thought, I don't like this about them, or they're not correct before God in this aspect. I don't know, countless times, right? We've probably all done it. Or maybe you're not even a Christian. You look at somebody else and you say, yeah, they need to get their life together. But how many times do we think of a way to try to assist that person? If we want to be judged by God the way that if we want, how's that work? If we want God to judge us, how about this? If we want mercy from God, we ought to extend it from other people to other people. And so thinking about God has pronounced judgment on the world, right? That we're all sinful and that is deserving of condemnation. But God didn't just sit up in heaven and be like, you're all sinful and you're all going to hell. And that's just pretty much the end of the story. I'm not going to do anything about it, right? He made a way at great cost to himself to help the one who had stumbled. So next time you judge someone, follow that up by saying, what can I do to help them? Even if helping them is at a great sacrifice to yourself. You want to be like Jesus? That's what you have to do. Not easy to do, not easy to apply. I have a lot of room to make application in that. Actually, now that I say it on a live video, I realize I have a lot of work to do on that, and needs to be something that I really give my mind to in the future. But think about that. God does not judge us and leave us out to dry. He has, with great sacrifice, made a way to help us escape that pitfall that we were in. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. All right, moving on. An important point here. Why does God say, judge not, that you be not judged? If that's the case, Jesus doesn't even follow his own commandment, because Jesus condemns the Pharisees. Neither do the apostles. The apostles often speak out against those who are wicked and trying to destroy the cause of Christ. We're going to talk about false prophets a little bit later on. They condemn false prophets. What do you mean, judge not? I think the idea there is that we don't make up rules and then hold other people to those rules. We don't just make up doctrine. We can't just make up what's godly and what isn't godly. That's part of the problem with the Pharisees, right? As Christians, we don't decide what's right and wrong. I don't get to say, oh, well, you're eating cake is a sin on Sundays. It better not be, or else I'm doomed. But we don't have the opportunity. We don't have the authority to say what's right and wrong. What's right and wrong comes from the nature of God. He is the standard for right and wrong, and we only enforce what he tells us to enforce as the carriers of the gospel. Anything beyond that is out of line. Anything less than that, and easing up any requirements of God, commands of God, is out of line. So we don't judge in the sense that we make laws and then hold people to them. And I think that's what he's getting at here. Humans, specifically Christians, only have authority to make statements of judgment based on the words of God, of Christ, and of the Spirit. All right, verse 6. Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. In my view, this verse is kind of standing alone in its context. It's its own idea. I don't see how to connect it with the verses that we just read, and I don't necessarily see how to connect it. Well, it may flow into the next couple verses, but kind of stands alone. It's its own unique idea here, in my view. If you see it a different way, I'd really be interested in hearing that. But it's kind of an odd illustration maybe for us. He says, do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. So, I'm going to stay with my notes. Here we go. This statement appears to stand on its own. We mentioned that. Jesus is calling his listeners to discernment when sharing his message with other people, when sharing the gospel, the good news. We should search out honest hearts that are prepared to hear the gospel, and we should not spend all of our time on those who see no beauty or value in Christ and are hostile to the gospel. So how does that work its way into the illustration? Who are the dogs and the pigs of verse 6? I think the answer is those who have no appreciation for what is valuable or what is precious. This would be somebody who hears the good news, the treasure that Jesus has come, the kingdom has come, the king is here, he's coming to establish the kingdom, and there's hope in the world. The judgment that was once on us, a way has been made for us to be forgiven. And they hear that gospel, which is a treasure, something valuable. It's holy, and it's like pearls, right? It's costly, very valuable. And they say, yeah, no, I'm not interested in that. Not only are they not interested in that, but they're hostile to it, like the Pharisees and the scribes who end up killing Jesus, right? They see no beauty in what Jesus has done, or who he is, or who God is, or who the Spirit is, and they are violent against that message. I think that's who he's describing here. And then, so the pearls, as we already talked about in verse 6, is the precious message of Jesus that the world needs so badly. So I think the idea that Jesus is trying to get across, don't spend all of your time trying to present what is valuable to those who can't appreciate its value. How do you bring that into application? Make it a little bit less abstract. I think the idea is, look, we all know people who they've heard the gospel. They've maybe even studied some of the evidences for the gospel. The gospel has been communicated to them effectively, and yet they will not accept it, right? Nothing that is presented to them will make them abandon what they truly love, their heart, what their heart is where their treasure is, right? They'll never abandon that to obey the gospel. And we've tried, we spent all this time doing it, and they just will not hear it. They're not interested. I think those are the ones who they don't appreciate it. There's no value that they see in it. And Jesus is saying, don't spend all of your time going after those people, going after somebody who's never going to accept your message. Why? Because there are honest people in the world. How many people are there in the world? 7 billion, right? And out of that 7 billion, there are many honest hearts who, if they do hear the gospel, they will say, wow, it's amazing what God has done for us. It's beautiful what Jesus has done in his death. It's fantastic what the Spirit has delivered to us in his word, and how he helps and assists us. I want to be a Christian. There's a lot of people out there like that who aren't being reached. Don't spend all your time throwing your valuables in front of those who will never appreciate the preciousness of the pearls. Verse 7 through 8. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Jesus here promises guidance and assistance and entrance to every honest heart that comes seeking him. Now, that could be in terms of unbelievers. There are unbelievers out there. Maybe they live in a place that's unreached by the gospel, or maybe they just don't have anyone to teach them the gospel. And so they're not followers of Christ, but they genuinely want to know the God revealed in creation and to know what he wants them to do and who he wants them to be. And the promise from the Lord here is, if you come knocking, you come seeking, you will find. And Paul preaches in Acts, I believe it's Acts chapter 17, that God is not far from any of us. You know, in a metaphorical way, God is just outside the door for all of us. What does he need us to do? What does he want us to do? To come knocking on the door, right? And he will make the way. He is the one who opens the door, and we can walk through. He'll make the way for us to discover him if we come to the door and knock. If you're seeking, you will find. And so, you know, I think a lot of times we look at these people who are out in unreached areas or areas of the world where Christianity isn't as prevalent, and we think, I don't know that they could get the gospel. I don't know that they could find God. And I think it's important to remember that, like Paul says, God's not far from any of us. God has infinite means and is infinitely capable, not just capable, but excels at accomplishing whatever he wants to accomplish. If there's a person out in some unreached area who wants to know God, it is an easy thing for God providentially to give them what they need. It's not a struggle. right? He may have planted it in the mind of a missionary 3 years ago to come to this island because this person would come knocking on the door of heaven, seeking the gospel, and that missionary is going to meet him there. Or, with the internet nowadays, maybe they'd even find a channel like this one and be introduced to the gospel, which is one of my great hopes. But God is infinitely capable of making that happen. And so if you come to the door, God will open the door. Also, for those who already know Christ, but are seeking opportunity or they're seeking guidance to pursue the Christian life, they will be assisted by God in becoming who he wants them to be. So as a Christian, how many times, I don't know, have I prayed, Lord, I don't know where to go. I don't know who necessarily you want me to be in the details of my life, maybe which career path you want me to pursue, where you want me to go as a missionary, all those details, the smaller details of our lives. I know you want me to be a Christian, but how? Show me what I'm lacking. And you're knocking at the door again. Lord, help me. I want to seek your word. I want to find out where the blind spots are in my life that need to be corrected. And the promises, the Lord will help you. And why wouldn't he help us? I think sometimes we doubt that maybe, or we think that he's not going to reveal those things to us. Of course he is. We're seeking him. We're trying to do his will. Why would God not open the door? And the promise here from Christ is that he will. Let's take a look at verses 9 through 11. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So you can think about this really flowing down from the verses we just read. And it's the idea that even as human beings, who our hearts are sometimes corrupted by evil thoughts, we are not always pure and unselfish, even we know how to care for somebody we love. If someone we love is in need, we know how to give them what they need, to give good gifts to our children, to our parents, to anyone who our heart is affectionate towards. And what he's saying here is that God loves you better than you could ever love anybody else, and God's heart is never corrupted by that greed or selfishness or corruption that gets into human hearts. How much better is he going to be at giving people what they ask for, what they need? So this son comes to his father and he asks for a need, and his father gives it to him. It's like every human being can do that. Who instilled that in them? God did, because he's the perfect gift giver. I heard someone talking today about how God doesn't need anything. His nature is to give, and he's the best at it. So again, he's not incapable at opening the door for anyone who comes knocking. Verse 12, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Probably heard this verse before. Even in non-Christian spheres, sort of places, I don't know, cultures, you'll hear this verse. Even in the business world, sometimes you'll hear it. And it's the idea, the golden rule: treat others the way that you want them to treat you. And you can think that if people really put that into application, the world would not look the same as it does today. In fact, it would be a fantastic place to live. Do to other people as you want them to do to you. Everyone would be kind. Everyone would be generous. Everyone would, you'd be tripping over each other, trying to be generous to each other. What's beautiful about Jesus' teaching sometimes is that in such few words, he's able to communicate truths that, if applied, the magnitude of their effect would be, the ripple of their effect would be world-changing. And of course, Jesus, knowing the nature of man, having created him, is able to do that. And so even the smallest statements of Jesus, don't skip over and think that, I got it down, right? If you understood the world and man's nature as well as Jesus did, you would be able to communicate truths that would take a lifetime to fully comprehend and apply to those human beings who read them. So I'm going to stay with my notes. We're off that point. We're off the notes. Back to the notes. I'm not making another hour-long video. When asked in chapter 22, so a little bit later on in Matthew, what the greatest command in the Old Testament law was, Jesus responded that the greatest was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, and then the second one was to love your neighbor as yourself. And so that love your neighbor as yourself is very much like this statement here, do unto others as you want them to do to you. He mentions the law and the prophets. He says, for this is the law and the prophets. That statement, law and prophets, is often used as a summary of kind of all of the Old Testament. The law being Moses, he's the lawgiver, and then the prophets came after him who delivered messages from God to the people in order to kind of bring them back in line with the law or correct their thinking on the law or encourage them to continue in following the law. So it's used as a summary statement. He says, the golden rule here is really a summary. It's the heart of everything that the Old Testament laws, or at least much of the Old Testament law, is trying to get at. Let's read verse 13 and 14. Check my time. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. So Jesus speaks about two gates in verses 13 through 14. This chair, it's so squeaky. You can hear it. It's terrible. I need to get a new one because you can hear it on the audio of the video. I don't know if that just annoys you. If you wondered what that was, that's what it is. It's the squeaky chair. Squeak chair. Anyway, I digress again. Verses 13 through 14, Jesus speaks of two gates here. The first gate leads to destruction. What's destruction? He's talking spiritually here. And that is eternal separation from God, destruction of the eternal punishment of the soul. The second gate leads to life with God eternally. That's heaven. There are two paths which lead to these two gates, and they're different. The first path, the path that leads to destruction, is wide, and it's really easy to walk down. This is like I like driving down wide roads. I don't know what it is, but there's a road by my house and it has like 6 lanes and it's not super busy. And so you always just feel like you have all this room. You're not going to run into anybody. It's great. People like walking down wide roads or wide paths. And this path is like that. It's an easy path that attracts a lot of people. It's not hard to find. You don't got to dig through any brush or trees or mud or nothing to walk down it. It's easy and it's wide and there's plenty of room and you can go wherever you want. And it's easy and enjoyable at first, but it leads, at the end of the road, it leads to destruction. It leads somewhere where nobody wants to go. The wide path represents life lived for self and not for God. It's easy. It's enjoyable to live a life that's centered on me, right? Living for yourself is not hard. In fact, it's one of the most natural things ever. I have needs. I have wants. I'm going to live to get myself what I want. But it will lead you somewhere that you don't want to go. And that's away from God in the end. You live for yourself, it's going to lead you away from God. Now we're going to look at living for God and deny. How's that work? Living for denying yourself, not living for yourself, and that will lead you to God. Anyway, so the second path is narrow and hard, and few people walk on this path. No, I'm not going to give this illustration. I am staying on my notes. Few people walk on this path. It's difficult at first, but it leads to great reward. The narrow path represents a life lived for God, and it's difficult to surrender your self-interest to live for God's interest. The Bible often talks about sacrificing yourself so that you can live for God. Jesus talks about, and I believe it's later on in Matthew, he talks about if you love your life and you try to find it here on earth, you live for yourself, then eventually you're going to lose it in eternity. But if you sacrifice your life, you give it up and you lose it so that you can pursue a life that is God-centered and focused, you'll find your life in the end in eternity. And Jesus does not downplay the sacrifice of the Christian life. He says it's not going to be easy to walk down a path that's narrow, it's hard, and not many people are going to walk with you. It's not going to be the popular route in life, but it will lead you to where you really want to be, to real joy, real lasting happiness in eternity with God, God's the only one who can provide those things to you. And it's important to notice that Jesus tells his disciples from the very beginning that they are going to be a minority. Genuine Christians in pursuit of the heart of God, to be Christ-like, driven and guided by the Spirit, are going to be the minority. Now, there may be plenty of nominal Christians or Christians who are kind of Christians in name only, but genuine Christians will be the minority. Jesus just says it right here. And so some application. We shouldn't let the fact that we are the minority discourage us or to cause us to believe that we're doing something incorrectly. A lot of people think, maybe my church isn't growing as fast as I wanted to. Why? Maybe I'm losing people because we're trying to implement steps to be more devoted. Why? Maybe I'm not doing something right. That's not necessarily a sign that something is wrong. In fact, it might be a sign that things are going better in the eyes of God for those true disciples than that things are going downhill. We should be worried, though, if we find ourselves in the majority. That's pretty self-explanatory. I won't go into that anymore. But, I think, however, there's always this tension, this struggle with churches to find a balance here, because we should always be willing to evaluate if our delivery and our teaching of the gospel requires adjustment. So I know that there's this tension that exists in a lot of churches, especially in more, quote, traditional churches, if you want to use that term. I grew up in kind of one of those. We had pews, we had stained glass on the side of the windows, we had the big wooden pulpit, right? Baptistry behind that, right? It's very like traditional church building kind of deal. And those churches that are thought of as more traditional, they often struggle with appearing or communicating the gospel in a culturally relevant way. What do I mean by that? That they're often like decades behind in their delivery, right? They're still using like I don't even know, like old literature that looks like it was published like 30 years ago, and they struggle with moving into relevant design and relevant using the technology that's available, in the modern day that everyone's using current day. It's always like they're decades behind, right? And why is that? And I think the reason is because there's really a difficult line, and it's really fuzzy in a lot of people's minds about, am I trying to change the way I deliver the gospel to make it more popular, to make it more culturally acceptable? Or am I doing that? I don't even know how to describe it, actually. Let's see. So there's the tension between what should be updated versus what shouldn't be updated. Maybe that's the best way to say it. I think churches should be on top of new technology, new platforms for sharing the gospel, but that can change and should change as the culture moves on, time moves on, technology moves on. But where a lot of people struggle is between the line where that stops and then changing the gospel begins. The gospel does not change. The principles that Jesus taught does not change. It doesn't matter which way the culture goes. That the eternal truths of the Sermon on the Mount, of the Gospels of the Apostles' writing, those never change. So it doesn't matter if the culture thinks that homosexuality or the way that the church approaches the authority of women versus men, complementarianism. It doesn't matter if the culture changes on those issues. We stand firm on those doctrinal truths. And so I think a lot of people really struggle with that tension of like, where do those two things meet? What can we update and still be preachers of the eternal truths? And then what should never be updated? I hope that made some sense to you. I might edit that whole section out. No, I won't. Anyway, but maybe somebody can explain it better down in the description comments below. I'd be interested in hearing some better words than mine, and maybe you can clarify that for all the people who are watching. So anyway, let's take a look at verse 15. This is 15 through 20. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Verse 15 talks about false prophets that come in like they're wolves coming into a sheepfold. Wolves eat sheep, right? So they're coming in disguise, though. Very stealthily, very subtly, very trickily, that's a word. Peter, John, and Paul all address false prophets in their epistles. And a prophet is just somebody who receives a message from God and then gives it to people. That's all it means. So if that word throws you off at all, it's no big deal. Just somebody who receives God's word and then delivers it to God's hearers, God's people. If a prophet is false, he's fake. It means that he or she is lying about one of two things. Either lying about the contents of the message. God told them to say one thing and they change it for whatever reason before delivering it to the people. It's not an accurate representation of what God delivered. The second thing, they're either lying about that or they're lying about the origin of the message. They say it came from God. Really, they just made it up. Right? So any of those could be a false prophet. False prophet is someone who lied to the church saying that they had received a message from God when they actually hadn't. And we find out if you study church history, there's a lot of people like this. And even if you look at many of the cultures or the other religions of the world, many of them were originated by people who claimed that they received an additional revelation from God. The Seventh-day Adventists, the Mormons, Muhammad and Islam, all of these and so many others, right? People came and said, I received a message from God. They can't prove it. There's no miraculous evidence surrounding it like there were with the prophets of old. But so many other religions start that way. And he warns us here about people who will do that. And John deals with these people in 1 John chapter 2, and he calls them liars because they're lying about God's message and they're lying about how they received what they're teaching. False prophets, as we mentioned, were very sly. They had a facade of being genuine, but they actually weren't. They weren't born out of the same humble obedience as a true follower of Christ. They had some ulterior motive, whether that was to get recognition from the church, or maybe it was to get into the bank account and steal all their money, or just to have influence among people, and that's what they craved, or to be respected. We don't know what it was, but they had some ulterior motive, and they weren't concerned about the good of the flock. They were concerned about serving themselves. Jesus gives a simple illustration here to test the identity of these dangerous individuals. And he says, by watching the fruit of a tree year after year, you will be able to determine what kind of tree that is. In the same way, watching a man or a woman for a period of time, it will become clear to you what kind of man or a woman that is, what kind of a prophet they are, genuine or not. So if a tree produces cherries every year, it's a cherry tree. If a tree produces coconuts every year, it's a coconut palm. If a tree produces raspberries every year, it's not a tree, it's a raspberry bush. If a man produces good and godly works every year, he is a genuine follower of Christ. And if a woman produces evil, I like how I just substituted woman in there. Those women, they're trouble. Eve Eve did this to us. But if a man or a woman produces evil and destructive works every year, he or she is not a genuine follower of Christ. It's definitely a she. So that's not hard to understand, right? You observe, what are their actions? That'll tell you who they are. It is not sufficient to listen to someone's words to distinguish their true identity. A greenhouse employee can put a tag on a cedar tree that says apple tree, right? That doesn't make it an apple tree. The words can say whatever they want, but when that tree grows up and produces, smelly, smell good cedar wood, you're going to be like, oh, this is not an apple tree. The words out front were wrong. The external did not reveal what was truly on the inside of that seed. Many false teachers are very skilled at saying all of the right things and making themselves sound really good, but it's only part of their sheep's costume. It's only part of their disguise and sneaking in. We have to be careful and watchful of a person over time to see the fruits, to see the works that they produce. I've had experience where people have come into a congregation and they very quickly earned the trust of the leaders of the congregation, and they've been in the pulpit and they've been teaching Bible classes and participating in all kinds of activities, and people have gone to them and sought their advice because they've been perceived as someone who really knows what they're doing, what they're talking about, like they're really a mature Christian. And after watching the fruits of those individuals for a while, it's been discovered that they were really bad trees, right? And having looked into their past and the reputations that they have at other places, it's been discovered that the fruit that they were bearing there and in their latest congregation was bad. And after a while, even though they've said and done and promoted all the right things externally, their actions are revealed eventually, and it's found out that they're not good, and so they end up doing damage to the church and leaving, or just staying around and poisoning everything. So we have to be careful. Use Jesus as test. Don't just listen to somebody's externals. Listen, or wait and see the fruit that they're producing. All right, verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. So in context, this flows very naturally from the last verses that we just looked at. Many people claim Jesus with their words, but words are not enough. Jesus says that these people are saying, Lord, Lord. They've confessed that Jesus is Lord, at least in some sense, at least partially. Right? They've claimed Jesus in some partial way, but clearly also they're deficient in some way. What is particularly scary, I think, about this text is that these are people who have done some good works. And in fact, the works that are listed here are works that could only be done by the power of God in the name of Christ. And these people are coming to Jesus and be like, look, Lord, we claimed your name. We did works in your name. We have not... Right, they've claimed, at least on the outside, and in some of their life and works, to be followers of Jesus. And so what's Jesus saying here when he turns them away? Think about application, and we'll kind of tie that meaning in here, is that there are many people today who claim the name of Jesus, but they only claim him in part. In some ways, they reject him. How? It could be that maybe they like a part of Jesus, they like a part of Christianity, and they even do some good works in the part that they like, but there's other parts that maybe they don't like so much. Maybe like the we were discussing earlier, they find a part of Jesus to be offensive in the fact that maybe it's not very culturally acceptable anymore to teach what Jesus taught on, say, divorce, or on lust. But I just don't really like God's teaching on living with somebody before we're married, right? That today, that's pretty culturally acceptable, right? So it seems like what's going on in this text is that, yes, they claimed the name of Christ. Yes, they did some good works in his name, but they were ashamed of some part of him. They were deficient in their claim of Christ in some way. They were ashamed of him somehow. The Christ that they preached and proclaimed was not Christ in his fullness. And because of that, Jesus says, I don't know you. You think about that, that may seem harsh to some people. But if we really think about it, I think it's almost an unthinkable thing, unconscionable thing, terrible thing for us as human beings to be ashamed of and not be willing to fully claim Christ in his fullness. To be ashamed of any part of him is a terrible thing. Why? Because if anybody has the right to be ashamed of someone else, God has the right to be ashamed of us. He created us in a garden, created us without sin, and gave us everything that we needed in the garden. And what do? What does Eve do? It's Eve. She gets her husband, and they both say, yeah, I know what God said. I know who God is, but you know what? I'm going to do this thing because I like it better. We have turned our back on a God who gave us everything. And God has said to us, I'm not ashamed of you. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, there's a passage there where Jesus says, or where it's stated, Jesus is not ashamed to call us his brothers. That's an amazing thing. He has every right to be ashamed of us. And yet he's not. And so why is it such a bad thing that we would not claim the whole Christ, the whole gospel, the whole God, the whole Spirit? It's because how could we possibly be ashamed of any part of a God who accepts all of us, even in our faults? If we've been made righteous through the blood of Christ, if we've been redeemed by the blood of Christ and had our relationship mended with the God who's been so good to us, how could we ever claim part of Jesus and then say, this other part, just not really into that? That would be kind of shameful for me to claim. And so if you're ashamed of any part of Jesus, you're ashamed of Jesus. And that's a sad thing. But there's a lot of people who say, Lord, Lord, who attend church, who do good works in the name of Christ. But because they object to who he is and who he tells us he is, that Christ will look at them and say, I never knew you in the end. So that's pretty scary. But it's also very sobering. So claim Christ in his fullness, even when culture says something else, and that's the way to go. I don't know how else to say it. It's the way to go. Where was I? I'm off my notes again. Here we go. This is going to be an hour-long video. Let me just read what I had in my notes. It's probably stated a little bit more concisely. We cannot claim the name of Christ if we aren't ready to embrace his true, full identity and everything it entails. If we are ashamed of a part of Christ or God or the Spirit, and that shame leads us to discard the real identity of our God for something more appealing in our eyes, one day that God will be ashamed of us for failing to represent him properly to the world. Yeah. When we discard part of Jesus, we fail to represent who he really is to other people, and that is a very dangerous way to approach our proclamation of Christ. Luke 9, chapter 26. For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. All right, so let's finish this chapter out, verse 24 and 27. This is the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount. So this is kind of how Jesus wraps things up. Every preacher, has a conclusion. This is Jesus' conclusion. Everyone, then, who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So Jesus is bringing he's bringing this great sermon, maybe the greatest sermon ever preached, to a close, and he's reinforcing the idea of its application. He started off this sermon with the Beatitudes. Be like this, right? And then be salt and light. And then change your heart to not just be about the externals, but be about the internal state of your heart. The internal state of your heart really needs to be your concern. And he goes into chapter 6, he goes in all through chapter 7 that we've studied today, and he's like, whoever hears these words of mine and does them. This is the person who takes it all and applies it. He's not after your ears here, he's after your life. And any effective sermon is not just out here to tickle somebody's ears and to have them walk away and be like, oh, that preacher's really eloquent. Right? It's for them to apply that stuff into their lives. Rant over. Whoever hears these words and does them is an applier, an applicationator, will have a solid foundation on which to build their lives. No tragedy or storm of life will be able to topple a life devoted to God. Not even death can capsize what Jesus protects. You think about that verse we read earlier, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And we talked about how a person's heart will be found on the foundation of what they genuinely love, what their affection is geared towards. Jesus says, if you apply my words, if you live for me, then this foundation is a rock, and winds are going to blow against it, and rain is going to fall against it, and it's not going anywhere. Your heart will be protected. I will protect what is safeguarded by me and by these eternal truths. It's also another reason we ought not change them. But in contrast, those who hear his words and do not do them will have their foundation torn from under them. Those who choose to build their houses on something other than the doctrines of Christ can, in this life, have their sense of worth and purpose torn away from them. Just like we talked about, a person who builds their life and their heart rests on these physical, earthly things, those can be taken away, whether it's by epidemic, whether it's by coronavirus, the stock market goes down and crashes, natural disasters, anything, right? It can wash it all away. And it's interesting that he uses rain and wind. Washes it all away and their heart is destroyed. Not only can that happen in this life for somebody like that, but it can also happen, or it will happen in eternity if we have not applied and if we have not claimed Jesus and if we found him something shameful. All who refuse to heed Jesus' words in this life will eventually lose their lives in eternity. And then the last verse 28. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. So the sermon has ended at this point, and the crowds are amazed at what they've heard, because Jesus speaks as one who has authority, not as the scribes. So you think about this, the scribes. They were students of the old law, and they had a lot of commentary about what the old law meant and how it was to be applied and followed. But they were not, they should not have been coming up with new rules and laws for people to follow. So they were interpreters of the law, and the people would often go to the synagogue and hear the law read. Every Sabbath day, they go to the synagogue, hear somebody read the law, and maybe it was a scribe who was doing it. And they didn't teach as if they were one who had authority to lay these things down. But here's Jesus coming. He has authority not to just read the old and interpret the old, but to lay down something new. And that's what he's been doing in the Sermon on the Mount. Not only is he saying that with his words, but they've just watched him do all the healings and have the authority and the power, the divine authority and power, to now come in and preach a sermon that has that divine authority and power backing it. So you see how the preaching and the miracles work together. The miracles confirm God's approval and that's not the word I want. Confirm God's, I don't know. Terrible point. Don't preach that point like that. The miracles confirm that Jesus is from God. That's how I wanted to say it. Easy enough. And then Jesus's words bring the message from God. And so you have the authority and you have the message. And hopefully you conclude, or thankfully Jesus concludes his sermon better than I just concluded this video. That seems to be a trend. But so that's the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 through 7. And a lifetime's worth of application there, especially, right in the opening, the Beatitudes. You're never going to be as merciful as you should, as peacemaking as you should, as gentle and meek as you should be. So much application there in all of this. So I encourage you to go back, study this. And again, take the notes that we have here, add your own thoughts, add your own applications. Obviously, with the time restraint that we have and the fact that I'm so long-winded, we can't flesh out every application that could be pulled out of here. There's just tons and tons of ways that we need to look at these in different perspectives and apply them to all the different situations of our lives. So thank you for hanging in for 3 hours of the Sermon on the Mount. I thought this was going to be a little bit shorter, but I guess not. Again, sorry. I'm trying to still kind of find that groove on these videos, make them concise, but make them also valuable. And so hopefully we'll get that locked down. I just wanted to say, again, a book is out online. Notes are out online. Next week, or in 2 days, we will do Matthew chapter 8, which is a great chapter. And also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're going to go all the way through the New Testament, hopefully in about a year, maybe a little bit longer than that. And we'll have some quality notes, hopefully, by the end of it. And we'll have changed lives by the end of it, too, which is most important. So thank you, everybody, again. Remember, invite people to come along and share the video, like the channel, like the video, subscribe to everything, and see you guys next time. Bye.